I'd like to introduce tonight's presenter, someone I've known all my life, a world-class carver and magician, and it's Bob Yorburg. Thanks, Bob. Anyway, here we are. It's the language of Acanthus. And before getting into this, I want to give you just a brief history. Long time ago, I was hired to do some personal appearances and what have you at festivals around the country, as well as stadiums and what have you. Very often, Paul Toran would be there with the General, who many of you have seen the General, and it will be, we hope, appearing next year at the Princeton rally, assuming Don Nielsen brings it over. So that'll be fun. So Paul Toran brought the General to these various events, and of course it had acanthus leaves on it. And I said, oh, that's wonderful. I'd like to make one. And he said, you can't. So that started the journey. And it was a journey of discovery because there were no sources for how to carve acanthus. So tonight, we're going to talk about the history of the design, how it's created, examples of it on carousel animals and band organs, and then how to actually go about creating these things. So next slide, please. Justin, thank you. So what is acanthus? Most people don't know. Let's go to the next slide. And acanthus is actually a plant with little spiky leaves, and it has appeared in everything from architecture to furniture to you name it for literally thousands of years. Next. And it's around you. Everyone says, what is acanthus? I've never seen it, but actually you have seen it. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that it's on your dollar bill. These are acanthus leaves, and they have been highly stylized. They don't look like the plant you just saw, but they are in, everywhere you look. Once again, next slide. So we see it in architecture. There's acanthus leaves. You can see flowers and leaves and the squirrel emanating from the acanthus. Next. You can see it in ceilings, in archways, just about anywhere you look, you'll find acanthus. And sometimes they're incredibly stylized. And I'll go into the different versions in a moment, but let's push on. Next. You'll see it in furniture. So a lot of the ornamentation on furniture, whether it's legs or arms or crests, you will see acanthus details. Next. So here's some doors with acanthus on them. Next. And here's a gate with an acanthus flower. Now, acanthus plants actually do flower, and the flowers are quite extraordinary. They're very vertical, but these are highly stylized nonetheless. You'll often see flowers in acanthus designs. Next. So anyway, I'm going to talk about how acanthus leaves and scrolls and designs are created because I find it to be quite interesting. Next slide. You'll find that there's basically two different types of acanthus. One is Baroque, where you have the C and the S curves, and you will see that a lot in the examples that I'm going to show you on the band organs and carousels. The other thing about this, which is, go back, interesting, is that all of this emanates from one point. And if you look at the lower left-hand corner, you'll see a little, what I call the root, and from there, every line in this drawing emanates from that one point. Now we go to the next slide, and you'll notice it's Rococo. Rococo is balanced but not symmetrical. The elements are kind of butting up against each other, and it's from the French rocaille, which is broken shells. Next. So what's interesting is everything looks like curvilinear, but it's not. There are no curved lines. They're accelerated curves, meaning, well, somewhat like a fishing pole or a spiral. So the curves get tighter and tighter and tighter as you move into the scroll, as opposed to a simple curved or arched line, which you won't see in any of these designs. Next. So if you look at the leaves, we're going to go through this rather quickly, but they're single leaves. Next. They're double leaves with a little lobe coming off the inside to the outside. Next, triple leaves. You can see the lobes are coming off both sides. Next. And here we have two doubles. Another one. Next. And here we have leaves butting up against each other, which is a lot of fun.
And
And it
go
has,
figure, I just agreed to work weekends there during the summer period.
right. And next. So here's a scroll unfolding on the left, and here's a scroll unfolding, touching another set of leaves. So you'll see both versions as we go to the photos. Next. This is a beautiful scroll at the end of a leaf, and you know, it's to me, it's like a fiddle top fern where it unrolls, unfolds. It's kind of interesting. I don't know if you've seen them, but they're fascinating to look at. Next. So a lot of times you'll see tulips or flowers in the designs. On the left, you notice there are leaf tips at the ends of the petals, whereas on the right, you'll notice there are scrolls. I'll show you examples of all of this in actual carvings. Next. Well, here's a crown, and what's intriguing about the crown is although it looks flat on the left, if you look at it from the side, it's actually curving down towards the viewer. So my view is that the carving is looking at you as much as you are looking at it. So in some of the band organs, you'll notice the bottoms are tilted up so that they're looking at you and you can look at it more easily or more readily. Some of the horses, you'll notice that things are canted so that you can see them more easily. Next slide. So here's leaves getting folded over, simple fold, and then you have a series of leaves folding over on the right. And once again, you'll see all of those in our versions of carousels and band organs coming up. Next. So here we go. These are more folded leaves, one with a leaf tip on the left and the other with a scroll at the end. Next. And here we have leaves folding over each other, and you'll see that often where vines cross over another set of vines, and you get layers of carving one on top of the other. It's a lot of fun. Next. So basically, and I'm going to show you this in our organ and our carousel photos. You have two basic elements. You're going to have a C scroll or an S scroll, and that's it. Everything else takes off from there. So it's really, the motif is rather simple, and yet it can look incredibly complex. Next. So once again, here's the root, and the root, you'll notice every line comes off that one single spot, and it goes out to the rest of the drawing. And it creates a beautiful movement, a flow, which is very lyrical. And when you're looking at band organs and horses, and they're moving, particularly the horses, it's really fun to see how these draw you in. Next. So here's an example of putting a pattern on a piece of wood and how that pattern would spring to life on the right. So there's a lot of interpretation. The same pattern can be interpreted many different ways. That's important because later I'm going to talk about carving the 165 facades. And what's intriguing is even though the patterns were obviously the same from the factory, the interpretations were quite different, and there were no two alike, and I'll show examples of that as well. So we're going to now push on to the next section, and it's what I call the language of Acanthus, and this is where it gets very interesting. My view is that Acanthus has been around for so long, literally thousands of years, that it's become a visual language. Next slide. So for example, you can see Acanthus as feathers in birds, and you'll see numerous examples of this where, clearly it looks like a bird and it looks like feathers, and yet when you look at it more carefully, they're obviously Acanthus leaves. Next one. You'll see Acanthus's hair, and there's a lot of examples of that. The classic green man has hair that looks like Acanthus leaves, sometimes beards and mustache looks like Acanthus leaves. Once again, you'll see examples of that on the organs and horses. as we move along. Next. Acanthus's fur. This is an extraordinary chariot side, and you'll notice that the fur dripping down is all acanthus leaves. So it becomes a metaphor in many instances. Next. So you'll see acanthus's scales. You'll see it in fish. You'll see it in mermaids. You'll see it in mythical creatures. And once again, you'll see it on wings. So it's really fascinating the way it appears throughout, the visual and sculptural environment. Next. So here's examples of green, what is classically called a greenman or a green man. And one on the right is from an organ, and the one on the left is just for fun. But everything from the eyebrows to the mustache to the beard, everything else is obviously acanthus leaves. Next. So as you know, the acanthus plant, which oddly enough is considered a weed in Greece and Rome, even though you find it on top of the Corinthian columns and elsewhere, it does have flowers, and these flowers in the carvings are incredibly stylized, but lots of fun. And often you'll see the center of the flower has a scroll emanating from it, and it can be quite extraordinary. Next. Hello? Aha. So acanthus on carousels. Now we're going to get specifically into carousels and band organs. This is a horse that I designed, and you will notice that there's acanthus leaves emanating from the griffin, and one pierces the saddle and goes through it and comes around. Another creates a loop that the lion is jumping through. So you can have a lot of fun with the acanthus, and we'll go on to the next one. Aha. So this is a densal rabbit, and the densal rabbit, you'll notice that the saddle trappings, the saddle blanket that is, has acanthus on it. And I think it's really nice the way the acanthus not only surrounds the saddle blanket, but pierces the banner that's running around the front. So it actually comes up, goes through the acanthus, and comes out, wraps around the front of the animal. So I think it's really fun the way the acanthus plays with the other elements. Next. There you go. This is a beautiful horse with the acanthus on the saddle, and I love the cherub on the back, and that's a loof horse, and you'll notice it's very stout. It's a wonderful carving, but it's a very subtle use of acanthus, and I think it works quite well. Next. This is a densal giraffe, and it has an extraordinary amount of acanthus on the saddle blanket, and some of it you'll notice looping around and peeking out on top of the banner, and also near the top of the saddle. So I think it's pretty nifty. Anyway, we shall push on. Next. So this is it's hard to see, but it's a chariot, and sort of the front corner of the chariot above the wheel is a bird with acanthus elements coming out of the wings. And I think and also you'll notice the acanthus coming out of the bottom of the bird to boot. So it's really quite extraordinary, quite different. But you'll notice the elements, what I call the language, appears throughout the visual environment, whether it's an animal or even a wheel or what have you. So let's push on. This is a center surround. So you would see this around the center of the carousel, hiding the gears and the mechanism and what have you. They were often painted, as this one was, and you'll notice the acanthus frame. Even though it looks like it's smaller at the bottom than it is at the top, it actually is, because it would tilt out or tilt down towards the viewer. And as we talked about earlier, oftentimes these carvings were looking at you as much as you were looking at them. Next. This is an extraordinary chariot side carved by Ilians, MC Ilians in Coney Island. I love the way the lion is grabbing onto the acanthus leaves, and his body is coming out of a sea of acanthus leaves as well. And the next slide shows you a close-up of the back, the head in the back. Oops, sorry. That's the one behind it. And this is what we call a green man. You'll notice the mustache becomes the acanthus leaves, and then the scrolls wrap around the entire chariot side. It's really quite an extraordinary piece, I think. And you'll notice the style of the acanthus leaves is quite different than some of the acanthus leaves you see on other carvings. So I guess what I should say is that from country to country, whether it's Germany, whether it's France, or whether it's United States, or what have you, the leaves become quite different. Even England, they tend to be a little more spindly and longer and sinuous, and it's quite nice to see the differences. Next slide. This is the head that was on the back of the chariot with the lion. And I love the idea that the tongue is now an acanthus leaf, and the fur once again becomes acanthus leaves. And if you'll notice, there are leaves actually turning backwards, turning up at where his neck hits the chariot side. And the ears are even stylized. And you could interpret those as acanthus leaves or not, but it's really fun because it's even though it looks like a real critter, it could be a very mythological being as well. Next. You'll see a lot of stylized painted acanthus on quite a number of things. You'll see it on fabric, you'll see it on furniture, you'll see it on, this is clearly a saddle. So I think it's a lot of fun to see those elements and to look at them more carefully as you're strolling past a lot of these items. Next. Once again, stylized acanthus scrolls on the blanket of a pinto pony. And I just think it's really beautifully done, and everything works in concert very nicely. Next. This is, I think, a fabulous steed, and you'll notice that the trappings have painted acanthus on them, wrapping around the entire front sides of the horse. Next. This is fun. This is a figure coming out of acanthus leaves. Rawl referred to this in his previous lecture, where he called it an acanthus chalice that the being was emanating from. And I think it's fun to see different versions of it on different figures in different places. And you'll obviously see this as well on band organs, not just carousel animals. Next. This is a gorgeous densal deer, and you'll notice he was heavy into acanthus on the saddle blanket, as well as the rest of the figure. So this is, I think, quite unusual and a lot of fun to see how it works. You'll also notice on this that on the saddle is painted acanthus as well, so it all works in harmony. Next. Lovely bridle on the side of the horse, and you'll notice the tassel above and below, and then on the bridle, of course, is the carved acanthus trappings. And I love the expression, the stargazer. It's just delightful. Next. Wonderful dog coming out of an acanthus scroll. So that's a lot of fun. And you'll see a lot of times, if you look at historical carvings, you'll see dogs, you'll see squirrels, you'll see cherubs, you'll see horses, you'll see all kinds of figures coming out of the scrolls. So it's really worth noting that that you can see all of these elements if you look carefully. Next. I think this is a lot of fun. It's a flute player, and the flute player is sitting on a bench of acanthus and surrounded by acanthus leaves as well. And of course, you'll notice there's some elements of fruit in there. Often you'll see that, particularly Grinling Gibbons did a lot of acanthus and fruit and what have you in his carvings in England. So now we're going to push on to band organs. And you'll notice that acanthus on band organs is really extraordinary and oftentimes very stylized. Clearly a Bruder organ, in my mind, somewhat flat, yet the design is extraordinary and really draws you in. Next. This is an interesting Rococo version of acanthus leaves that is Art Nouveau in nature, but you'll see that you have the shell at the bottom of the carving, and then the pieces come up and they become more stylized acanthus. It's lovely to see both in the same carving, as well as flowers emanating from the scrolls. Next. Delightful. You'll notice these are all C scrolls, and we talked earlier on about C scrolls and S scrolls and what have you. But if you look at this entire frame, they're all C scrolls that are just butted up against each other. So it's not a continuous Baroque style carving. It's more of a Rococo, and all of the carvings butt up against each other and swirl past each other. And in this instance, it's creating a frame for some really lovely flowers. And I think it's nice to note the way oftentimes designers would take different elements and add them together to create an overall effect. A lot of fun. So next one. I just think this is fabulous, where you have acanthus leaves, you have some Baroque and Rococo elements, and then you also have fruit dripping down, pears, I'm assuming apples, what have you, flowers. It's really, really nifty. Next. This is sort of wedding cakeish, but fun. And you'll notice this is another example of everything emanating from the root and coming up and swinging up, and you can get some leaves passing over the elements. And you'll also notice that the frames are stylized acanthus leaves as well around the paintings. Next. Delightful griffin. You'll notice the griffin's tail is acanthus, and there's some acanthus elements coming off of the wings. And there's even an argument to be made for, are those wings, like for example, there seems to be a scroll at the very end of the wing, which implies acanthus, although it's not literally. All the other, you'll notice, items are C scrolls butting up against each other, as we talked about earlier in the lecture in terms of designing acanthus. And when you pop enough C scrolls together, it becomes very vibrant. A lot of fun, a lot of movement. Next. Lovely cherub sitting next to some really wonderful, very deeply carved scrolls, and then with a swag of flowers to boot. So we didn't miss anything here. And it also has nice lines running along the acanthus carving, detailing the leaves, which I think is a lot of fun. Some of the organs, the earlier organs, you'll notice the carvings are incredibly deep. And in my mind, the further along we got, the flatter they got, and the less robust they were. Next. Here's another. This is a wonderful cartouche with acanthus leaves and surrounded by cherubs playing instruments, of course, and then there's more acanthus surrounding it everywhere. Next. Typically acanthus elements that are in effect framing whatever's going on. So if you look very closely on the columns, you'll see some acanthus leaves. You'll see them above the figure. You'll see them to the left of the figure. So they're all around. But here, I think more subtle in that you're not seeing scrolls everywhere. Next. Lovely. Another beautiful centerpiece. It's surrounded by scrolls, and the painting is a lot of fun. Clearly, they filled in a lot of the missing space with paintings as well as the carvings. Next. This is interesting. This is very definitely acanthus, but is approaching a slight Art Nouveau style. It's not there yet, but it's somewhere in between. But I still think the elements are delightful. And you'll notice the top, the crown, is bending over, looking at you, which I think is a fun detail. Next. More acanthus. This is really more rococo with the little cove elements, as well as the way they turn over each other, and it's not a continuous scroll. They're elements that are abutting each other. And also you'll notice around the center opening where the pipes are, each of those elements are like little C scrolls, or S scrolls. They're not a continuous scroll, so it's more rococo rather than the Baroque. Next. Lovely detail. You can see that the columns are very beautiful in that they're continuous just about. The frames, lovely. The frame, you'll see there's an S curve on the right side, C curve on the top. So when you take the S's and C's and put them together, you end up with an overall pattern that I think creates a lot of wonderful effects. Next. This is over the top, and I just love it. But there's some really fabulous elements. You'll notice the creatures on the bottom have acanthus, feet, and acanthus scrolls surrounding the cherubs, acanthus across the top and on the columns, and just about everywhere you look, you're going to see more and more of these details that are just delightful. Next. So once again, here's an interesting example of not only the acanthus carvings, but you'll notice the creatures have acanthus elements, like the I guess dragons, if you will, on the bottom on either side. You'll notice the acanthus tails, even acanthus details on the legs, the face on the top. There can be an argument made for acanthus elements in there as well. So it's really borrowing from a lot of different genres, and you'll notice it's also the Art Nouveau is creeping in to boot. Next. Delightful set of scrolls. This is more Baroque in that they're all coming out of that single scroll root on the bottom, and they're moving around the organ and framing a lovely oil painting of a parrot. Next. Once again, a little over the top, but I think terrific. You've got lots of acanthus elements everywhere you look, whether it's the frame surrounding the painting on the bottom, whether it's the crest at the top and the elements on the side. It just keeps on going. So it's really a lot of fun. And you'll notice how robust, how deep the carvings are. So it's really, I think it draws you in just, no uncertain terms. Next. Another example, just as a side view of the same one, you just to get a sense of the depth of the carvings. Next. Here's another close-up of the side, but the scroll on the very top of this, on the very bottom, they're probably 6 inches deep at least, which is just a lot of fun to carve. Next. This to me is a little more formal in that it's not scrolling. They tend to be rectilinear, and yet they still flow and have a very sinuous effect. So it's a nice, I think, joining of two different styles, and yet it works out incredibly well. So it's nice to see when you can take an element, stylize it, and it still works. And there's lots of examples of that. Next. Close-up of acanthus flowers that we talked about earlier, acanthus scrolls, and they're basically on top of other elements that are, creating an effect where sound can come out and you can see what's going on, and yet they're delightful to look at. Next. Wonderful cherub sitting on top of acanthus scrolls. And it just creates, I just think, a fabulous effect. You'll also notice the acanthus around the opening in the center. So there's a lot going on here, and it's worth spending some time at some point and seeing how they do it. Also, you'll notice we talked about the leaves crossing over each other. On either side of the cherub, you'll see the leaves crossing one on top of each other below the feet and hand, right and left. Next. This is the golden egg, which is an organ I made for Bob Stumer. Bob did all of the illustrations. So it was designed such that the illustrations could be framed. As such, you'll see in the bottom in the middle, there's Jack and his mother standing looking at the beanstalk. You can see the beanstalk peeking out on our left. The beanstalk pokes up from the bottom of the organ, wraps around the column, comes up through the clouds, and you can see the beanstalk popping up through the clouds there. And Jack is standing in front of the castle, looking at the castle, and flanking Jack is on the left, the goose waiting for the golden egg to happen, sitting on the nest. And then on the right, you can see the golden egg has appeared and the goose is looking at it. Down below on the shelf on the left is a nest, which is empty, and on the right is a nest with a gold-leafed egg sitting in it. So it tells the entire story of Jack, and I think it's delightfully done. So what we did was created the top to A, sit on each of the four columns, and B, highlight his illustrations as such. And then the bottom was an existing piece that needed a tremendous amount of restoration. And then we added the elements, the illustrations that Bob did, and the carved flowers are on top of the illustrations. So there's many levels of detail here. It's a lot of fun, and at some point, hopefully some of you will get to hear it. It's really worth hearing. Bob's done probably 350 or more arrangements for this organ, and it's a lot of fun to listen to. Next. Next, there we go. This is the top to a Ruth 33A, which came out of Coney Island. And if you go to the next one, you'll see the top in situ, and there it is painted to match the rest of the organ. It was there was no top there originally, although it does exist. And so this was made to fit into the trailer, and it completed the look entirely. Next. This is a 89 key Gavioli in Bill Edgerton's collection. Remember, next presentation will be Bill Edgerton, which will include this and many other organs and other instruments. It'll be a lot of fun. There was no top for this, so you'll notice right and left on the bottom are these two shells with leaves surrounding them. That got duplicated and carved and put up in the center above the bandmaster. There are some leaves above the center painting on either side poking up. You'll notice the green ones, and those are replicated above on either side of the crown. And then this piece that is carved is 13 feet wide. As such, there is a seam, and we put the seam in front of or on top of the column that's one end from the left and one end from the right. And as such, I put some tulips hanging down, getting smaller and smaller, so that you will never see the seam. And the overall shape of the top was based on an 1898 photograph, which was the year this was built, but it was a different organ that had a top, and we took the overall profile outline of it and replicated it and made sure that everything matched and landed on each of the columns. So that was a lot of fun, and I think it really adds to the overall effect of the machine. Next. This is a Wurlitzer 165. Wurlitzer built 25 of them. There's only 11 remaining. 3 of the 11 were missing facades, so I was asked to replicate them. And so I'm going to spend a couple of minutes now just going through that process, and then we'll go to a Q&A. But I wanted to show you how all of these elements come to life as a wood carving, regardless of whether it's on a horse, on a band organ, or wherever else. So next. So I start with rough sawn wood right out of the tree, not kiln dried. Next. When it's air dried, you can get some beautiful carvings. And next, if it's kiln dried, you'll notice the wood can get a little brittle. So it's better to have it air dried if possible. Not everyone does that, but I have lots of wood air drying for years, and then I dig in and create the carvings accordingly. Next. So this is, as I said, what was intriguing to me is that of the 165s, I visited quite a number of them. Even though they were clearly carved from the same patterns, there's no two at all alike. So we'll scroll through the next couple of 165s, and you'll notice each one quite different from the next. Next. This is an entirely different style with a different top, even though the wings are pretty much the same. Next. This one has lights throughout the facade, which I didn't put on any of the ones that I did, but it's a lovely feature, lovely element. But if you're doing a lot of painting, then it doesn't allow as much room to do that. Next. So once again, the same pattern, but yet different interpretation. So that was intriguing to me. I figured they'd all be the same, yet the measurements, the scrolls, the depth, everything was quite different. Next. So what I did is I did some rough drawings from the facades that I visited, and I also did lots of photographs. Next. And took these drawings and refined them so that I could use them as patterns to cut out the wood. Next. And so each of the elements next became refined. And you'll notice, like, for example, on this one, there's actually two layers. There's the top layer and the bottom layer. And as such, the top layer would kind of cross over the bottom layer to give you the depth that was required. Next. So here's, once again, a couple of layers of carvings. These would be for the side. Next. And then the pencil drawings were transferred onto wood. And a lot of times when you transfer them, the pencil wants to follow the wood grain. So you have to go back and tidy up the drawing and correct it a bit so it looks correct. Then all the pieces are scroll sawed out. Next. And you'll see some of these pieces get to be pretty big. Next. And you end up with a blank, just a blank cutout piece of wood. Next. What I did was I took the pieces of wood and carved what I call basically master patterns from which all other carvings would be made. Next. So what happened is these were half an organ. One side of the organ was carved, and they didn't have to be finished carved. They just had to be the correct shape, and you'll see why in a moment. Next. And so here's examples of some of the carvings that were created to make the patterns to make the 3 165 organs. Next. So here's more patterns. You'll notice lots of tools to shape them. Next. So these patterns, next, were then taken. Next. And there's quite a collection of carvings. And you'll notice, by the way, that some of them get to be quite deep, like 4 to 6 inches deep each. Next. They're put on a carving machine. You'll notice on the left is a finished pattern, which you just saw in the previous pictures. And on the right are 2 cutout pieces glued up in layers. So those are probably easily 4 inches thick. And what will happen is, as the follower goes over the original, there's these cutters that will, like router cutters, that will go over the copies and create rough copies. Next. So here we are. You'll notice, oh, I'm sorry, there's a right and a left from the original. So the reason I only had to carve half an organ is because the machine will do a mirror image of right and left. Next. So here we are cutting out pieces. Next. And you can see the original, which is rather robust, is being followed to carve the copies. Next. And the copies come out pretty rough, but nicely shaped. Next. And there they are. There's a pile of carvings that are all copies, and they basically imply the shape. Next. And then what happens is we take the tools, the hand tools, next, and start carving the pieces. Next. And you'll notice that they start going from pretty rough to very smooth and very nice, nicely detailed. So it's all there. It's just a matter of bringing it to life. Next. And you'll see that they become incredibly robust with time. Now, the beauty of this piece, and I referenced this earlier, this is the bottom of the organ. The bottom of the organ is about 16 inches deep, and the top of the organ is about 6 inches deep. And the top of this piece is about 12 inches deep. So what does that imply? It implies that it's tilting up and looking at you. So whatever the illustrations are on there, however the scrolls are finished, it's all looking at you while you're on your carousel ride, as well as you looking at it. Next. So you can see they get kind of thick, and you'll see above is the top, and below, of course, is the bottom, and they're all layered one on top of the other. Next. And you can see that it gets to be rather thick, rather ambitious. In point of fact, the top of that scroll is so deep, it's probably 6 or more inches deep. As such, the figure will be standing on that scroll when it's done. Next. There's the bottom, and it's going to be set on the top of what's going to be set on the cutout, and then all the other carvings are glued onto that 1 inch thick template. Next. So here it is. You'll notice the back is all hollowed out, and there's 2 reasons for that. One is weight, and the other is you don't want the carvings to crack. If there's a lot of mass with temperature and humidity changes, it could crack. This will not. Next. So you'll see the bottom piece is on top of the template, and then we're going to start adding all of the other elements. So next. There we start adding the pieces that are going to be around the center swell shades, and the top is in place already. Next. Gets to be kind of big. It grows rather quickly. Some nice close-ups of the scrolls. They have not been painted or gold leafed or glazed yet. The background paintings are there already. Next. And some close-ups of the elements that you'll see around the center swell shades. Next. But you'll notice there's lots and lots and lots of layers of carvings, and it's just really fun to see how they all interact with each other and intertwine. And to me, it's kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. It was really a blast to try to figure out in which order to carve them so that they all fit together. Next. Another example of the center surround. Next. Close-up of some scrolls. Next. Here's the entire piece, minus the wings and minus the top, primed. You're looking at probably 4 to 6 coats, sanded between each coat. So it's basically like a glass finish, which is very important when you're doing gold leaf, because any imperfection would show up, immediately, and you see it from across the room. Next. So this is the top with the scenes painted in. Of course, the scrolls have not been gold leafed or glazed or any of that yet. You'll see that next. The side panels, they go in behind the center section that you saw just a moment ago. And the windows are for the drums, the bass drum and the snare drum. Next. Here's the other side. So you'll notice the scrolls are pretty beefy, and in that the organs had different thickness scrolls. We opted to go for the earlier version, which was more robust, which I think gives it a lot more movement and flavor and just a lot more fun. Next. So here we go with the sections finished, painted, not ready for leafing and glazing yet, but go ahead. Next. Oops, there you go. So the facade is painted, the wings are on, the top is on, the bottom is in place. So we're ready to move on and go to the final stage, which will be next. Figuring out what color scheme we want for the overall organ, what goes with the paintings the best. So Pam did a kind of a window, if you will, behind the organ to put the paintings, and then we overlaid different color schemes to see which one worked the best. As it turns out, and on this particular organ, we all voted and we all agreed on the final colors. Next. And here it is with the gold leaf and glazing and scenes there. You'll see on the left is the maracas. Not the maracas, the castanets. On the right is the triangle. In the middle is the glockenspiel, and those shades open and close to control the volume for the pipes. So that's it. Next. I want to thank everyone: Paul Toran, Pam Hesse, Roger Weigand, Bob Stumer, Craig Smith, Glenn Thomas, Bill Edgerton, Tom Billy, Laura Yorburg, and countless others. So next, we move to the Q&A, and I'm assuming there's lots of questions. So this is your turn to jump in and ask anything you like.